moving on to our keynote speaker for today, Mr. Pahala Mansuri, Vice Minister of State-Owned Enterprises. We would like to know what are the supports that the government is providing or facilitating in order to accelerate green investments in Indonesia. So to Pahala Mansuri, the stage is yours, Pak.
Thank you, AZ Venture, for inviting me to to become one of the keynote speaker in today's webinar about the Earth Day, with the topic of invest in our planet, how saving our planet should also save your money. I think I would like to start by thanking AZ Venture, Pak Michael, and all of the others from AZ Ventures, Ibu Afina just now. I think I would like to start discussing how investing in the emissions reduction program is actually very, very important. I think it is actually widely known that global warming is actually a very high profile and very high stake issues. But I think the major milestone that we have actually witnessed is the adoption of the Paris Agreement in 2015, whereby during the COP21 in Paris, about close to 200 countries are committing to be able to limit the global warming to be below 2 degrees Celsius. And I think it is the impact of being able to limit it at 1.5 Celsius is actually very significant, as you see that if that actually happens, about 210 million people are actually going to be exposed to severe drought. So during the speech just now, I think Pak Devin mentioned about that investing in the future of the planet is not only good for the money, but I think it is actually very, very essential because it really defines what would be the quality of life of the globe in the future. Not only that, I think about 14% of the world population will be exposed to severe heat waves, coastal flooding, about 290 million homes. And I think something that is actually very, very relevant today, because we are seeing that food crisis is probably something that we need to be very, very cautious about. We've seen that the cause of the global warming will also cause some reduction in crop nutrient value, therefore creating some potential health risk to more than 600 million population. And I think since the agreement in Paris, we've seen that a lot of countries have committed to be able to achieve the net zero mission. About 31 countries have actually committed to be able to achieve that by the year of 2050. And more than 90 countries are now committing to be able to achieve net zero emission. Some are actually committing to achieving that by the year of 2060, just like Indonesia. And I think for Indonesia in particular, we see that as part of the national defined commitment, we are actually committing to be able to reduce about 29% of the greenhouse gas emission by the year of 2030, including the impact of the LULUCF or the land use, and about 41% reduction if we are to be able to get international support. And I think this is something that is already committed, and Indonesia, whether it is actually the energy, waste, as well as agricultural sectors, the sectors that is actually going to be very, very highly impacted are going to be the energy sector, as you see, whereby within the energy sector, the target of reduction is about 11% from the total BAU by the year of 2030. And therefore, I think this is actually an alarm for us, a call for action for us, whether you are actually in the government, in the private sector, or in the SOE sector like myself. How are we going to be able to help Indonesia to achieve and implement and make sure that Indonesia will be able to achieve the NDC targets by building commitment all across the sector, all across these different stakeholders, and how are we going to be able to get everyone to understand what will be the NDC for each of the particular sector, and how are we going to be able to continue to create the environment, having the capacity for us to continue to drive that, because this is actually going to be a very massive, significant changes, not only within the energy sector, but also in the other sector. In particular is actually the agricultural and the forest and other sectors that is actually heavily using land as the main resources. And Indonesia already has defined a regulation. I think by the end of 2021, there was a Perpres, Peraturan Presiden number 98, which is actually going to be the major regulation that puts together the framework about how carbon economic value is actually going to be implemented for us to be able to achieve the national defined commitment that was actually presented just now, and the presidential decree within the next couple of months is expected to be translated into 48 derivative rules. Whether, as I said, it is actually going to be within the environment and forestry regulation, within the energy sector, the Minister of Energy and Mineral Resources regulation on the procedures on implementing this carbon economic value. Particularly, I think the first sector that is actually going to be heavily affected is within the electricity, particularly within the power plant sector. And I think later on, the Ministry of Finance and the Minister of Internal Affairs will actually also regulate about the detailed calculation, collection, payment and deposit related with how are we going to be able to report and calculate the carbon tax and the carbon tax reduction mechanism, including what we know already about the carbon offset markets. Because Indonesia has already broadly defined that if a company or if an institution is not going to be able to achieve what is actually been committed in terms of the reduction emission target, they will need to actually do buy the carbon offset credit to be able to achieve the target. And if they have not actually achieved the target after they buy the carbon offset credit, then they will need to pay the carbon tax. Within the Ministry of SOE, what we are actually doing is trying to now, as what I have actually developed just now, what I've actually explained just now, how are we going to start to encourage all of the SOE, particularly those that are heavily related with this regulation. We see that there are 8 companies or 8 SOEs that are actually going to be heavily affected, including Pertamina in oil and gas, PLN in electricity, Pupuk Indonesia in fertilizers, Mine ID in the mining sector, PTPN in the plantation sector, Perhutani in the forestry sector, and Cement Indonesia within the cement sector. And then the last company or the last holding that we think is going to be heavily affected meaning that they are going to play an important role, which I will actually explain to you later on when we talk about the carbon offset market, is BKI, or Biro Klasifikasi, which is actually our holding in the survey sector. And we are actually looking at it from the point of view that each one of the SOEs that we mentioned just now, they will need to actually be able to come up with how are they going to be developing the decarbonization agenda all the way from now until the year of 2030. And I think in the spirit of the topic of today of how are we going to be able to correlate the effort to save the planet with making more profitable business, we see that we need to approach it not only how are we going to be able to reduce the end-to-end emission by, for example, trying to develop the co-firing of biomasses within the power plants of PLN, or how are we going to be able to convert from diesel or from gas to new and renewable power plants, or to be able to actually retire the existing coal-fired power plant, or how are we going to be able to optimize the water management within the activities of our SOE. But we also are looking at this as an opportunity for us to invest for the future and make money from these investments. And we are actually looking at it, how are we going to be able to build adjacent business from the existing business that they have right now, so that they will actually have specific initiatives within each of the SOEs to build adjacent businesses that is actually correlated with the needs to reduce the emission, whether it is actually scope 1, scope 2, or scope 3 that they are actually emitting. So in the case of Pertamina, for example, the kind of adjacent business that they will need to do is developing the geothermal. Or with them, we also are requiring them to actually develop the bio-blending gas oil, whether it is actually POME-based or whether it is actually pharma-based. And they will need to obviously work with other SOEs. And that is why when we are actually looking, going to drive the different adjacent businesses, they will not actually look at it from the existing BUMN as a silo, but they will need to actually synergize and work with the other SOEs. So in the case of bio-blending gas oil, Pertamina, for example, will need to actually work with PTPN, our plantation group, so that they can actually develop what is actually required to develop the CNG, which is actually going to be coming from the POME or from the other products of PTPN, and developing HVO Pertamina to produce, for example, something like used cooking oil-based HVO products. Or in the case of Mine ID, Pertamina, and PLN, and Antam, then they will together develop an integrated EV battery development, which includes also the downstream part of that, not only by producing the battery only, but how are we going to be able to provide the infrastructure that will be required by the motorcycles or the cars to be able to actually charge their battery or swap their batteries. Or in the case of PLN, how are they going to actually develop a program to convert from LPG to electric stove? And I think the third one that we are actually encourage them is really how are they going to be able to explore the step out opportunities that probably are not related with their existing business, but actually are, go and beyond their existing businesses that they have. So again, in the case of PTPN, they will need to actually develop, because they used to just produce oloin or CPO coming from the production of palm that they have, but they will need to actually go further than that to produce biogases and CH4 from their pome to help Pertamina to produce the HVO, for example. And these are something that we require them to actually chart for the next 10 years. And I think we are now also to push forward the SOEs going forward. We see that there are really 5 ecosystem initiatives that will be pushed forward by the Ministry of SOE in supporting decarbonization effort by the government of Indonesia. One, as I mentioned just now, how the SOEs together, the 7 that I actually mentioned just now, plus BKI, can play a role in terms of developing and structuring the carbon market ecosystems, not only between SOEs, but if there are private sectors that is actually keen in developing the carbon offset market in Indonesia, whether it is actually voluntary or compliance-based carbon offset market. Obviously, this is actually something that will be beneficial from everybody. And I think the second initiative that we will be pushing is how are we going to be able to develop a much more sustainable industrial clusters, implementing new technologies such as CCUS, hydrogen within the cluster of the energy sectors, or utilizing the existing facility by Pupuk Indonesia, for example, to develop the green hydrogen or green ammonia that we just alluded just now, to become part of the co-firing that will be required by the various gas-fired power plant in the industrial clusters. The third initiative that we are actually pushing is how are we going to maximize the country's natural-based solution. I think there are certain examples already in Indonesia. Indonesia is very rich in terms of natural-based solution, whether it is actually reforestation, peatland protection, and I think in combination with the carbon offset market, developing the country's nature-based solution will be a very powerful initiative for the future. The fourth is how are we going to, together within the 4 consortium that actually makes IBC right now, to scale up the battery production, as well as developing the EV ecosystem itself. So we are looking at these two cluster of battery as well as EV ecosystem is the future. This is actually the opportunity for Indonesia to become a significant contributor to the global production of the value chain of EV, because Indonesia is very rich, not only in nickel, but I think we see that there are opportunities for us also to become a major manufacturer, maybe start with the 2-wheelers EV, and then later on with the 4-wheelers EV. And how are we going to be able to increase the capacity of the non-renewable energy in Indonesia, whether it is actually geothermal, solar PV, biomass, green hydrogen, green ammonia. Indonesia has the unique opportunity to become one of the leaders within these new and renewable energy sources. So we hope that these 5 initiatives are going to be the major initiatives that we are going to go forward. And we, of course, are looking forward to have a collaboration between our SOEs with the private sectors. We would like to welcome collaboration with the startups. We know that there are already some startups, for example, that has initiated the NBS or the nature-based solution implementation. We would like to be able to actually continue working with them leveraging on the perhutani areas that they are actually managing, where as well as the PTPN areas. We would like to work with other private institutions or startups, for example. For example, a couple of weeks ago, IBC working with Pertamina and Gojek, for example, to scale up EV adoption in Indonesia. So going forward, we really want to hear how SOE going to be able to collaborate with the private sectors and all of the startups to develop this new industry of renewable related clusters. Thank you.
Thank you for the explanation, Mr. Pahala Mansuri, Vice Minister of State-Owned Enterprises. Allow me to give a little recap to our audience. There is much support from the government. Indonesia government has made bold commitments and efforts in supporting decarbonization, aiming to reach net zero by 2050.